What happens when an Apache medicine woman must choose between saving the life of the man she's falling for or avenging her mother's death? This isn't just a love story, it's a tale of impossible choices that will leave you questioning everything you believe about forgiveness and justice. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more emotional Western romances that will touch your heart. Title: Apache Medicine, Woman Falls for Enemy's Son, the choice that changes everything. The 8 characters. The desert wind carried the scent of sage and something else, something wrong. Ayana White Dove pressed herself against the red rock wall of the canyon, her medicine bag heavy against her hip, listening to the voices echoing off the stone walls below. Apache woman's worth more than gold in Santa Fe, came the rough Spanish accent of Joaquin Mendez, especially one who knows the plant magic. Ayana's blood turned to ice water. For 24 years, she had walked these sacred canyons gathering healing herbs protected by her grandfather's warnings and her own caution. Today, that protection had failed her. She could see them now, 4 men with ropes and chains, their horses stamping impatiently in the narrow canyon below. Slave traders, the worst kind of evil that haunted the borderlands between Mexican territory and Apache sacred ground. Her fingers found the small knife at her belt, the one her mother had given her before the day at Fort Apache when everything changed. Before Colonel Sullivan's cavalry had ridden through their peaceful encampment, leaving blood and tears in their wake. "Spread out," Mendez ordered his men. "She can't have gone far. Apache women don't run, they hide and wait like rabbits." Ayana's jaw tightened. Her mother Singing Bird had been no rabbit. Neither was she. The first man rounded the boulder where she crouched. Ayana moved like lightning, pressing a handful of powder into his face, a mixture of ground chili and crushed beetles that would blind him temporarily but cause no permanent harm. Her mother had taught her that even enemies deserved mercy when possible. The man screamed and stumbled backward, clawing at his eyes. "She's here. The witch is here." "Not a witch," Ayana whispered, already moving. "A healer. There's a difference." She sprinted up the rocky slope using handholds her grandfather had shown her as a child. Below, the men shouted and gave chase, but they were heavy with weapons and greed. Ayana was light with purpose and desperation. A gunshot cracked through the air. Then another, but the shots weren't aimed at her. They came from the opposite direction, from the mouth of the canyon. "Federal Marshal," a deep voice called out. "Drop your weapons." Ayana risked a glance over her shoulder. A lone rider had emerged from the desert scrub on a bay horse, a Winchester rifle trained on Mendez and his men. The stranger wore no marshal's badge that she could see, but his bearing was military, his movements precise and deadly calm. "This is none of your concern, gringo," Mendez snarled, but his hand was already moving away from his gun. "Apache woman under my protection," the rider replied, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "I suggest you find other business." Ayana frowned. No white man had ever claimed to protect her. In her experience, they brought only death and sorrow. The standoff lasted 3 heartbeats. Then Mendez spat into the dirt and jerked his head toward his men. "This isn't finished, Apache girl," he called up to her. "Joaquin Mendez doesn't forget." They mounted and rode away, leaving dust and the echo of hoofbeats. The stranger remained motionless on his horse rifle, still ready until the sound faded completely. Only then did he look up toward Ayana's hiding place. "You can come down," he said quietly. "They're gone." Ayana stayed where she was, studying this unexpected savior. He was tall, even sitting in the saddle, with dark hair that needed cutting and the kind of weathered face that came from years under the southwestern sun. His clothes were simple, worn denim and cotton, the practical garments of a working man rather than a soldier or a gentleman. But something about the way he held himself spoke of military training. More troubling were his eyes. Even at this distance, she could see they held a weight of sadness that matched her own. "Why?" she called down to him. "Why what? Why help me? What do you want?" He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze never leaving her face. "My name is Marcus Sullivan. I'm looking for a medicine woman named Ayana White Dove. I believe that's you." The name hit her like a physical blow. Sullivan. The same name as the colonel who had destroyed her family, her people, her world. Ayana's hand went instinctively to her knife. "If you're looking for me, then you're no different from them," she said, nodding toward the direction Mendez had taken. Marcus slowly dismounted, keeping his hands visible. I'm not here to hurt you. I need your help. The last white man who said that to my people left 23 dead, including my mother. She watched his face carefully as she spoke. Most white men would show confusion or indifference at the mention of Apache deaths. Marcus Sullivan's face went pale with something that looked like recognition and pain. Fort Apache, he said quietly, 1871. You know of it. The words came out sharper than she intended. I know of it. His voice was barely above a whisper. Miss White Dove, if you come down from there, I'll tell you everything. But first, I need you to know I'm dying. The simple statement hit her like a second blow. In all her years of healing, Ayanna had learned to recognize the truth about death. It had a sound, a smell, a presence that couldn't be faked. This man, this Marcus Sullivan, carried death in his voice. What makes you think I would save the life of a white man? Because I've spent the last 3 months learning everything I could about you. You've never turned away anyone who came to you for healing. Apache Mexican white settler, your grandfather told me you see only suffering, not skin color. You spoke to my grandfather. Anger flared in her chest. Dakota was 73 years old and more precious to her than her own life. If you've threatened him, he's safe, more than safe. He's the one who told me where to find you today. Marcus looked up at her with those pain-filled eyes. He said you would want to hear my story before you decided whether to let me die. Ayanna felt the world tilt slightly beneath her feet. Her grandfather, the wisest man she knew, had sent this stranger to her Dakota, who had held her while she wept over her mother's body, who had taught her that some wounds never fully healed, but could still be transformed into strength. She began to climb down the rock face, moving with the fluid grace of someone who had grown up in this harsh landscape. When she reached the canyon floor, she kept the length of the horse between herself and Marcus Sullivan. Talk, she said simply. Marcus leaned against his horse's shoulder, and she could see now that the movement wasn't casual, it was necessary. Whatever was killing him had already begun stealing his strength. 7 years ago, I was a medic with the United States Army. My unit was involved in actions against Apache peoples throughout the Southwest. He paused, swallowing hard. Actions I believed were necessary at the time. And now I know better. Now I know that what we did was murder disguised as military strategy. His hands, she noticed, trembled slightly as he spoke. During the war, I was exposed to experimental chemical weapons meant to flush Apache warriors out of cave systems. The effects were supposed to be temporary. They weren't. Ayanna moved closer, her healer's instincts overriding her caution. She could see it now, the slight yellow tinge to his skin, the way he held his left side as if something there caused constant pain. The poison is in your blood, she said. It wasn't a question. For 4 years, I've been to every doctor from San Francisco to St. Louis. They all tell me the same thing, 6 months to live. That was 2 years ago. Despite herself, Ayanna felt a stirring of professional curiosity. A man who should have died 2 years ago but still walked and talked and saved strangers from slave traders. His constitution must be remarkable. But more than that, someone had been keeping him alive. Who has been treating you? Marcus smiled, and for the first time since their conversation began, some of the sadness left his face. A remarkable woman named Dr. Sarah Morrison. She runs a small clinic near Fort Huachuca. Officially, she treats cavalry families and ranch workers. Unofficially, he paused, she's been secretly providing medical care to Apache people for the past 3 years. The name meant nothing to Ayanna, but the description did. There were whispers among her people of a white woman doctor who could be trusted, who treated arrow wounds without asking questions and never reported Apache visitors to the military authorities. Dr. Morrison sent you to me. She said you were the only person she knew who might be able to create an antidote for chemical poisoning. She also said, Marcus hesitated. She said you would understand what it meant to carry the weight of innocent blood. Ayanna stiffened. I have never killed innocent people. No, but you live with the pain of their deaths every day just as I do. The difference is your pain comes from losing them. Mine comes from causing their loss. The desert wind whistled through the canyon, carrying the scent of rain that might come and might not. Ayanna studied this dying white man who claimed to carry guilt for Apache deaths who had risked his life to save hers from slave traders who somehow knew her grandfather and her reputation. Dr. Morrison was right about one thing, she said finally. I might be able to help you, but why should I? Marcus pushed away from his horse and took a step toward her. The movement was careful, controlled, but she could see the effort it cost him. Because, he said quietly, if you save my life, I will spend whatever time I have left making amends for what my unit did at Fort Apache. I have evidence, documents, witness statements, proof of war crimes. I can bring justice for your mother and the others who died that day. Justice. Ayanna tasted the word like bitter medicine. You think white man's justice will bring my mother back to life? I think, Marcus said carefully, that it might prevent other mothers from dying the same way. It was the right answer and the wrong one all at once. Ayanna had dreamed of justice for 7 years, but she had never imagined it might come from the hands of a white soldier. And she had certainly never imagined that obtaining justice might require her to save the life of someone connected to her people's suffering. Show me your hands, she said abruptly. Marcus held out both hands, palms up. Ayanna stepped closer, close enough to smell the desert dust on his clothes, and something else, the sweet, sickly scent that always preceded death. His hands told her a story. Calluses from weapons and horse reins, yes, but also the soft pads and precise finger positioning of someone who had spent years handling delicate medical instruments. Old scars from surgical tools, not just violence. These were the hands of someone who had saved lives as well as taken them. You were a medic, she said more to herself than to him. I was a healer first, a soldier second. I had hoped. Marcus's voice grew quiet. I had hoped that made a difference. It doesn't, does it? Ayanna looked into his eyes again, those gray eyes that held such profound sadness, and made a decision that would change both their lives. No, she said, but it makes you worth saving. She turned and began walking toward the path that would lead them out of the canyon. After a moment, she heard Marcus's boots on the stone behind her and the quiet sound of his horse's hooves. Where are we going? He asked. To my grandfather's camp. If I'm going to heal you, I'll need plants that don't grow in these canyons. And Marcus Sullivan Baham. Yes. Dr. Morrison was wrong about one thing. I don't understand what it means to carry the weight of innocent blood. She glanced back at him over her shoulder, but I'm about to learn. The journey to her grandfather's camp took 2 hours following hidden trails that wound through red rock formations and stands of desert oak. Marcus rode in silence, conserving his strength, while Ayanna walked ahead, her mind racing through everything she knew about plant-based antidotes for chemical poisoning. The challenge was significant. Most Apache medicine focused on natural toxins, snake bites, plant poisoning infections from dirty wounds. Chemical weapons created by white men's science were outside her traditional knowledge. But Ayanna had always been gifted at seeing connections others missed, at understanding how one healing principle might apply to an entirely different problem. As they traveled, she found herself stealing glances at Marcus Sullivan. He sat his horse with the easy competence of someone born to the saddle, but she could see the careful way he moved, the slight favor he showed his left side. Whatever the chemical poison was doing to his body, it was systematic and relentless. More puzzling was the way he looked at the landscape around them. Most white men saw the desert Southwest as empty wasteland, valuable only for what could be taken from it, gold, silver, cattle grazing land. Marcus Sullivan looked at the red rocks and sparse vegetation with something approaching reverence, as if he understood he was traveling through a sacred place. Tell me about the chemical weapon, she said as they paused to let his horse drink from a small spring. Marcus dismounted slowly, favoring his left side. It was called Desert Fire, designed to create a gas that would make cave systems uninhabitable without causing permanent harm. He laughed bitterly. That was the theory anyway. But the reality was different. The reality was that it bonded with anything organic it touched, skin, lungs, blood cells. It changed the chemistry of the body at a level our doctors didn't understand. Marcus knelt by the spring, cupping the cold water in his hands. The men who were exposed with me, I'm the only one still alive. Ayanna absorbed this information, her mind automatically cataloging it alongside everything she knew about poisons and antidotes. How were you exposed? We were ordered to deploy the weapon in a cave system where Apache families had taken shelter. When the wind shifted, Marcus's voice trailed that off. You breathed the poison meant for my people. Yes. And the families in the caves, Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his hands still cupped around the spring water. They died, Miss White Dove. All of them. 23 people, including children and elders, who had never raised a weapon against anyone. Ayana felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came whenever she thought about Fort Apache, about all the innocent lives lost to white men's fear and greed. But this time the tightness was accompanied by something unexpected, a recognition of shared grief. This man, this soldier, carried the deaths of her people as a burden rather than a victory. In her experience, that was unprecedented among white men. "What was the date?" she asked quietly. Marcus looked up at her, water dripping from his fingers. "November 15th, 1871. 3 days after Fort Apache." Ayana's voice was barely audible. "3 days after my mother died." The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of shared history neither had chosen. Finally, Marcus stood, moving with the careful precision of someone managing constant pain. "I didn't know," he said. "I didn't know about Fort Apache until much later, didn't know that my unit's actions were part of a larger campaign of," he struggled for the word, "extermination." "Now you know." "Now I know." Marcus walked back to his horse, every step measured and deliberate. "The question is whether that knowledge means anything to you." Ayana watched him prepare to mount, noting the way he gripped the saddle horn for support, the small grunt of pain he couldn't quite suppress. He was dying by degrees, this white soldier who carried Apache deaths as his own personal torture. "It means," she said carefully, "that I will try to save your life. But understand this, Marcus Sullivan, if I succeed, the life I save will belong to my people's justice, not to you." Marcus's foot was already in the stirrup, but he paused to look at her. "I wouldn't have it any other way." They resumed their journey, climbing now toward the high desert where her grandfather kept his camp. The air grew thinner and cooler, scented with juniper and the distant promise of snow from the mountains. Ayana found herself thinking about choices, the ones that had led Marcus Sullivan to that cave 7 years ago, the ones that had brought him to her canyon today, the ones she was making now by agreeing to help him. Her mother had always taught her that every choice created ripples, spreading out in all directions, touching lives in ways that couldn't be predicted. What ripples would come from saving the life of a white soldier? What consequences would follow from allowing him to die? "Miss White Dove," Marcus's voice interrupted her thoughts. "Yes. When we reach your grandfather's camp, there's something else I need to tell you about my family name, about why I really came looking for you." Ayana felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "What about your family name?" "The colonel who commanded the forces at Fort Apache, Colonel Harrison Sullivan. He's my father." The world seemed to stop moving. Ayana's steps faltered in, and she turned to stare at the man on horseback behind her. Marcus Sullivan, son of the man who had killed her mother, son of the officer who had given the order to fire on an unarmed Apache camp, son of her family's destroyer. "You're lying." "I wish I were." Marcus's face was pale, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he had just revealed. "I've spent 6 years trying to gather enough evidence to see him court-martialed for war crimes. It's why I'm still alive, Miss White Dove. It's why I haven't given up despite the poison in my blood. I can't die until I've made this right." Ayana's hand went to her knife again, but this time the motion was unconscious, driven by 7 years of rage that had just found its perfect target. "Your father murdered my mother." "Yes. And you want me to save your life so you can, what, ease your conscience by testifying against him?" "I want you to save my life so I can destroy him." Marcus's voice was quiet but filled with a cold determination that surprised her. "I want you to help me live long enough to see Harrison Sullivan stripped of his rank, his reputation, and his freedom. I want him to die in prison, knowing that his own son brought about his downfall." The desert wind whistled between them, carrying the scent of sage and something else, the approach of evening of decisions that couldn't be unmade. Ayana looked at Marcus Sullivan, this dying man who claimed to want justice for her people, the son who sought to destroy his own father for crimes against strangers. In her 24 years of life, she had never encountered anything so complex, so morally tangled. "If I heal you," she said slowly, "and you fail to keep your promise, if you take the life I give you and use it for your own purposes instead of my people's justice, then you'll kill me yourself," Marcus finished quietly. "I understand." Ayana stepped closer to his horse, close enough to see the violet tinge in the whites of his eyes, the slight tremor in his hands that spoke of systemic poisoning. Because once I begin the healing process, there will be no going back. You'll be bound to me, Marcus Sullivan. Your life will be mine to give or take away. Marcus looked down at her from his saddle, and for the first time since she'd met him, Ayana saw something other than sadness in his gray eyes. She saw resolve. Then I'll be in excellent hands, he said simply, against every instinct screaming at her to walk away, to let the son of her enemy die slowly and painfully in the desert. Ayana White Dove nodded once and resumed walking toward her grandfather's camp. Behind her, Marcus Sullivan followed, carrying death in his blood and promises of justice on his lips. Ahead of them, both lay choices that would determine whether love could grow from the ashes of old hatred, whether healing was possible between people whose histories were written in each other's blood. The sun was beginning to set, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson that reminded Ayana of her mother's favorite time of day. Somewhere in that thought was either hope or heartbreak. She supposed she would find out which. Dakota's camp sat in a natural depression between two red rock mesas, hidden from casual view, but positioned to catch the first light of morning sun. Three traditional wickiups made of bent saplings and deer hides stood around a central fire pit, their smoke holes releasing thin ribbons of gray into the evening air. Ayana's grandfather emerged from the largest shelter as they approached, his weathered face showing no surprise at seeing her arrive with a white stranger. At 73, Dakota White Bear still moved with the fluid grace of a man half his age, but his eyes held the accumulated wisdom of someone who had watched the world change in ways both terrible and unexpected. Grandfather, Ayana called out in Apache as she neared the fire. I have brought the dying soldier you told me about. Dakota nodded gravely and replied in the same language. And what have you decided about his life, granddaughter? I will try to save it, but I'm not sure I should. Marcus dismounted carefully, keeping his hands visible as he approached the camp. Dakota studied him with the intensity of someone evaluating a potential threat, his gaze taking in every detail of the stranger's appearance and bearing. You may approach the fire, Dakota said in heavily accented English. But slowly. Marcus walked forward with deliberate steps, stopping just outside the circle of firelight. I'm honored to be welcomed in your camp, grandfather. My name is Marcus Sullivan. I know who you are, Dakota replied quietly. The question is whether you know. It was a strange response, and Ayana saw confusion flicker across Marcus's face. But he simply nodded respectfully and waited for permission to sit. Ayana, Dakota switched back to Apache. Bring water and food for our guest. We cannot discuss healing while his body lacks strength. As Ayana moved to obey, she caught her grandfather's eye and saw something there that surprised her, not the wariness she expected when he looked at white men, but something closer to compassion. It was the same expression he wore when treating wounded animals, as if Marcus Sullivan was a hurt creature rather than a potential enemy. She returned with a gourd of water and a bowl of rabbit stew, setting both beside Marcus without meeting his eyes. The simple act of providing food felt strangely intimate, more personal than she was comfortable with. Thank you, Marcus said quietly, and something in his voice made her look at him despite herself. He was looking at the food as if it were a precious gift rather than simple hospitality. When he took his first sip of the stew, Itana saw his eyes close briefly in what appeared to be genuine gratitude. How long since you have eaten a proper meal? She asked. 3 days, maybe 4. Marcus managed a small smile. When you're dying slowly, appetite becomes negotiable. Dakota settled cross-legged across the fire from Marcus, studying him with those penetrating dark eyes. Tell me about the poison in your blood-white soldier. Marcus set down his spoon and looked directly at the old man. It's called Desert Fire, a chemical weapon designed to flush Apache people out of caves without killing them. He paused. The design was flawed. You were there when it was used. I was there when it killed 23 innocent people. I was there when it started killing me. Marcus's voice remained steady, but Ayana could hear the weight of old grief beneath the words. I breathed the same poison meant for your people. Dakota was quiet for a long moment, his gaze never leaving Marcus's face. When he spoke again, it was in Apache directed at Ayana. This one carries death dreams, he said. I can see them in his eyes. He does not fear dying, he fears living with what he has done. That doesn't change who his father is, Ayanna replied. No, but it changes who he is. Dakota looked back at Marcus, switching to English. You have spent many moons searching for my granddaughter. 6 months, Marcus confirmed. Since Dr. Morrison told me about her gift for treating poisonings that other healers couldn't cure. And in those 6 moons, what have you learned about the Apache people? It was clearly a test of some kind. Marcus set down his water gourd and considered the question carefully. I've learned that everything I was taught about your people was wrong, he said finally. I was told you were savage nomadic, without culture or spiritual depth. I've learned that you are people of great wisdom with complex social structures and a relationship to the land that white men have never understood. What else? Marcus glanced at Ayanna, then back at her grandfather. I've learned that the woman your granddaughter has become, despite her losses, is a testament to the strength of Apache families. And I've learned that the crimes committed against your people were not acts of war, they were acts of murder. Dakota nodded slowly. Good. Now tell me why you believe Ayanna should risk her own spiritual health to save your life. The question caught Marcus off guard. Ayanna could see him struggling to understand what her grandfather meant. I don't understand, Marcus said honestly. To heal deep poison, healer must take some of that poison into herself, Dakota explained. Apache medicine works through connection, through sharing. If Ayanna saves your life, she will carry part of your death burden. She will see your memories, feel your pain. The poison that kills your body will touch her spirit. Ayanna felt her breath catch. Her grandfather had not told her this, though. Now that he spoke the words, she recognized their truth. Deep healing always required the healer to take on something of the patient's suffering. It was why she had always been careful about who she chose to help and why. Marcus's face had gone pale. I won't ask her to take that risk. You already have, Dakota pointed out calmly. The moment you came seeking her help, you asked her to join her life to yours. The question is whether you are worthy of such a sacrifice. I'm not, Marcus said immediately. No one is worthy of that kind of sacrifice. Then why should she make it? Marcus looked across the fire at Ayanna, and she saw something in his gray eyes that made her chest tighten. Not pleading or desperation, but a kind of resigned acceptance that spoke of a man who had already made peace with death. She shouldn't, he said quietly. I should never have come here. He started to stand, moving with the careful precision that betrayed his pain. Ayanna found herself reaching out to stop him before she realized what she was doing. Sit down, she said firmly. Marcus paused, half risen, looking at her with surprise. Sit down, she repeated. No one makes decisions about my healing work except me. Marcus slowly settled back down, his eyes never leaving her face. Across the fire, Dakota watched their interaction with the satisfied expression of someone whose test had yielded the expected results. Grandfather, Ayanna said in Apache, why didn't you tell me about the spiritual risk? Because you needed to choose based on your heart, not your fear, Dakota replied. And because some risks are worth taking. This white man's life is worth me taking poison into my own spirit. Look at him, granddaughter. Look with healer's eyes, not with grief's eyes. Ayanna studied Marcus Sullivan, really studied him for the first time since she'd met him. She saw the obvious things, the signs of systemic poisoning, the careful way he moved to accommodate constant pain, the military bearing that even illness couldn't entirely erase. But she also saw subtler things. The way he held his hands when he spoke, gentle and precise, like someone accustomed to healing rather than harming. The respect in his voice when he spoke about Apache culture. The genuine gratitude in his expression when he looked at the simple food she had given him. Most telling of all was the absence of something she saw in every other white man she'd encountered. The assumption of superiority, the barely concealed belief that Apache people were lesser beings. Marcus Sullivan looked at her grandfather as he would look at any wise elder, with respect and attention. I see a white soldier who carries guilt like a disease, she said finally. And what else? Ayanna looked deeper, using the sight her mother had taught her, the ability to perceive the spiritual health of those around her. What she saw in Marcus Sullivan surprised her. I see someone who has been healing others even while he dies, she said slowly. Someone who uses his medical knowledge to help people even though it costs him strength he can't spare. Dakota smiled. Morrison told me this white soldier has spent the last 2 years treating Apache people in secret. No payment, great risk to himself. She says he is the only white doctor who has never asked her to report Apache patients to the army. This was news to Ayanna. She looked at Marcus with fresh eyes, seeing now why he appeared so much weaker than a man with his condition should be. He had been expending energy he couldn't afford sharing medical knowledge and supplies with people who had every reason to distrust him. "Is this true?" she asked him directly. Marcus looked uncomfortable with the attention. "Dr. Morrison has been doing the real work. I've just assisted when I could." "Assisted how?" "Medical supplies mostly. Antibiotics, surgical equipment, laudanum for pain management. Things that are hard for Apache people to obtain through normal channels." "Where do you get these supplies?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, and Ayanna saw something like shame cross his face. "From my father's command. I steal them." The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Marcus Sullivan had been systematically robbing his own father's medical stores to provide aid to the very people that father had been ordered to suppress. "For how long?" Dakota asked quietly. 3 years, ever since I learned the truth about Fort Apache and the other campaigns." "And if you're caught," Marcus shrugged slightly, "court-martial, prison, death probably. It doesn't matter, I'm dying anyway." Ayanna felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of the tight knot of anger she had carried for so long. This white soldier, this son of her enemy, had been risking his own life to help her people while slowly dying from poison meant for Apache families. "Show me your medicine bag," she said abruptly. Marcus looked confused. "I don't have a medicine bag." "Your medical supplies, the ones you carry with you." Understanding dawned in Marcus's eyes. He reached for his saddlebags, moving slowly and keeping his movements visible to Dakota. From the leather pouches, he withdrew a collection of bottles, bandages, and small metal instruments that Ayanna recognized as surgical tools. But it was the way he handled these items that told her the most important thing about Marcus Sullivan. His fingers were gentle, with each piece of equipment reverent, almost the way her grandfather handled his sacred healing stones. These were not the tools of someone who had given up on healing, but of someone who saw medicine as a calling rather than just a profession. "You could have sold these supplies," she observed. "Use the money to seek better treatment for yourself." "I could have," Marcus agreed, "but people would have died. Apache people specifically, who had no other source of medical care." It was the final piece of evidence Ayanna needed. This man, whatever his bloodline, whatever his past mistakes, was a healer first and a soldier second. The choice he had made to spend his remaining time and energy helping others rather than seeking comfort for himself spoke to a moral strength that transcended race or family history. "Grandfather," she said in Apache, "I want to try the deep healing." Dakota nodded gravely. "Are you certain, granddaughter, the risk is real? You may carry his poison dreams for the rest of your life." "I'm certain." Ayanna looked across the fire at Marcus, who was watching their exchange without understanding the words but clearly recognizing the importance of what was being decided. "But I have conditions." "Name them," Marcus said immediately. "First, if I succeed in healing you, you will complete your mission to bring your father to justice. No matter how long it takes, no matter what it costs you personally." "Agreed." "Second, you will never again take action against Apache people, even if ordered to do so by military authority." "I resigned my commission 2 years ago," Marcus said quietly. "But yes, I agree." "Third," Ayanna paused, not entirely sure why she was adding this condition, "you will stay near this camp while you heal. The process may take many weeks, and I'll need to monitor your condition daily." Marcus glanced at Dakota, who nodded slightly. "I understand," Marcus said. "And Miss White Dove, thank you." Ayanna felt heat rise in her cheeks at the simple words spoken with such genuine gratitude. She stood abruptly, needing to move to channel the nervous energy that came with making irrevocable decisions. "We'll begin tomorrow at dawn," she announced. "Tonight you rest. Grandfather will prepare a place for you to sleep." She started to walk away from the fire toward the path that led to her favorite thinking place among the rocks. But Marcus's voice stopped her. "Ayanna." She turned, surprised to hear him use her first name. In the firelight, his face looked younger somehow, less weighted down by pain and guilt. "Why?" he asked. "Why are you willing to take this risk for someone like me?" It was the same question she had been asking herself since the moment she decided to help him. Ayanna looked at this dying white soldier, this son of her enemy, who had spent his last years serving her people, and tried to find words for something that existed more in the heart than in the mind. Because she said finally, healing is the opposite of revenge, and I'm tired of carrying so much poison in my own heart. She walked away before he could respond, leaving Marcus staring into the fire with an expression of wonder that her grandfather observed with satisfaction. That one will give you much trouble, Dakota said conversationally in English, nodding toward the direction Ayanna had taken. Marcus looked at the old man with surprise. Sir, my granddaughter. She has never learned to do anything the easy way. Dakota's lined face crinkled with what might have been amusement. Healing you will be simple compared to admitting she cares whether you live or die. I don't think she cares about that at all, Marcus said carefully. Then you understand women even less than you understand Apache healing, Dakota replied. Come, I will show you where to make your sleeping place. Tomorrow you begin learning what it means to be saved by someone whose mother you helped kill. The words were harsh, but somehow not unkind. Marcus stood slowly gathering his medical supplies with hands that trembled only slightly from fatigue rather than pain for the first time in months. Above them, the desert stars were emerging in the clear mountain air. The same stars that had watched over countless generations of Apache people, the same stars that would witness whatever healing or heartbreak emerged from the unlikely alliance between a dying white soldier and a medicine woman whose capacity for forgiveness was about to be tested beyond all measure. The healing began before dawn with Ayanna's hands pressed against Marcus's chest, feeling for the patterns of poison in his blood. He lay on a blanket beside her grandfather's fire, his shirt removed to expose the yellow-tinged skin that spoke of systemic toxicity. The chemical has bonded with your blood cells, Ayanna murmured, her fingers tracking the pulse points at his throat and wrists. It's changing the way your body processes everything: food, water, air. That's why you're dying so slowly. Marcus's eyes were closed, but his breathing remained steady. Can you counter it? Maybe. But first I need to understand exactly what we're fighting. Ayanna had spent most of the night in meditation, preparing her spirit for the deep healing work ahead. The process her grandfather had described was real. To cure poison this complex, she would need to open herself to Marcus's memories, to experience firsthand the moment he was exposed and the years of suffering that followed. It was dangerous not just because she might absorb some of the toxicity, but because she would also absorb his emotional pain. 7 years of guilt, regret, and slowly approaching death. The human spirit wasn't designed to carry that much anguish all at once. But as she felt the steady rhythm of Marcus's heart beneath her palms, Ayanna knew she was going to try anyway. I need you to think back to the day you were poisoned, she said quietly. Not just remember it, relive it. I need to see through your eyes what happened. Marcus's jaw tightened. Ayanna, you don't want to see that. Trust me. It's not about what I want. It's about what you need. She moved her hands to his temples, feeling the heat radiating from his fever-touched skin. Are you ready? Marcus nodded once and Ayanna closed her eyes, opening her healer senses to the deepest levels of perception her mother had taught her. The transition was immediate and overwhelming. One moment she was kneeling beside Marcus in her grandfather's camp. The next she was standing in a rocky canyon 7 years in the past, watching through Marcus's memories as he prepared chemical weapons for deployment against her own people. The younger Marcus moved with the efficient precision of a trained military medic, but even in memory, Ayanna could feel his discomfort with the mission. He had argued against using an untested weapon, had requested permission to evacuate civilians, first had been overruled by his commanding officer. A tall man with graying hair and cold blue eyes, a man whose voice carried absolute authority as he ordered the deployment of Desert Fire. Colonel Harrison Sullivan, Marcus's father. Ayanna watched through Marcus's eyes as the older man gave orders with the casual indifference of someone discussing the weather. In the memory, she could feel Marcus's growing horror as he realized the caves contained families, not warriors, children and elders who had fled there seeking safety. Deploy the gas, Colonel Sullivan ordered. Drive them out into the open where we can deal with them properly. Sir, there may be non-combatants in those caves, Marcus said carefully. All Apache are combatants, soldier. Deploy the weapon. The memory shifted, and suddenly Ayanna was experiencing the moment when the wind changed direction. She felt the burn in Marcus's lungs as he breathed the chemical meant for Apache families. Felt his desperate attempts to don protective equipment while shouting warnings to the other soldiers. Too late. The gas had already done its work both inside the caves and among the men who deployed it. Ayanna experienced Marcus's frantic rush into the caves, his desperate attempts to provide medical aid to people who were already dying. She felt his anguish as he realized that every Apache man, woman, and child in those caves was beyond help. She lived through his horror as he understood that he had participated in the systematic murder of innocent people. But the memory didn't end there, Befobstone. She followed Marcus through the aftermath, the official reports that classified the deaths as enemy casualties. The commendations given to the soldiers involved the complete absence of any investigation into what had actually happened in those caves. And she felt Marcus's growing realization that his father had known exactly what Desert Fire would do, had counted on it, had used his own son to deploy a weapon of mass murder against defenseless families. The emotional weight of that betrayal hit Ayanna like a physical blow, driving her back into her own body with a gasp that left her shaking. Marcus's eyes opened immediately. "Ayanna, are you hurt?" She stared at him, seeing him now with the full knowledge of what he had endured. Not just the physical poison, but the spiritual devastation of learning that his own father was capable of such calculated cruelty. "Your father knew," she whispered. "He knew the weapon would kill everyone in those caves." "Yes." Marcus's voice was barely audible. "I didn't understand that until much later. I thought it was a miscalculation, a tragic accident. It took me 3 years to gather enough evidence to realize it was planned murder." Ayanna sat back on her heels, her healing senses still partially open to Marcus's experience. She could feel the poison in his blood now, as if it were in her own body, a slow, relentless corruption that attacked every vital system. But she could also feel something else. The chemical weapon had bonded not just with Marcus's blood cells, but with his guilt and grief. The poison fed on his emotional anguish, growing stronger every time he remembered what he had been part of. "That's why you're still alive," she said suddenly. "The poison should have killed you years ago, but you won't let it." Marcus frowned. "I don't understand." "You're keeping yourself alive through sheer force of will because you believe you deserve to suffer. The guilt is actually slowing the poison's progress." It was a phenomenon Ayanna had seen before in different forms: warriors who survived impossible wounds because they had unfinished business, mothers who lived years beyond what should have been possible because their children still needed them. The human spirit could temporarily override physical limitations when driven by powerful enough purpose. "If that's true," Marcus said slowly, "then healing the poison might not be enough." "No," Ayanna agreed. "I need to heal the guilt as well, but I can't do that alone." She moved to her medicine bag, withdrawing a collection of plants she had gathered during her years of learning. Some were familiar Apache remedies: juniper berries for blood purification, wild mint for nausea, willow bark for pain. Others were experimental combinations she had never tried before, plants whose properties she had studied but never had reason to use. "What I'm about to give you will counter some of the chemical effects," she explained, grinding the plants together with a small stone mortar. "But the deeper healing requires something else." "What?" Ayanna looked at Marcus, directly meeting his gray eyes with her dark ones. "You have to forgive yourself." Marcus's laugh was bitter. "I helped murder 23 innocent people. Forgiveness isn't possible." "Not for what you did," Ayanna said patiently. "For what you were tricked into doing. There's a difference." She mixed the ground plants with water from her grandfather's sacred spring, creating a tea that smelled of earth and growing things. As she worked, she felt Dakota watching from the edge of the firelight, his presence steady and reassuring. "Drink this," she said, offering Marcus the wooden cup. "All of it, even though it tastes terrible." Marcus accepted the cup without hesitation, a gesture of trust that touched Ayanna more than she expected. He drank the bitter mixture without complaint, though she could see him fighting not to grimace at the taste. "Now what?" he asked. "Now you tell me about the evidence you've gathered against your father." For the next hour, as the medicinal tea began its work in his system, Marcus described 3 years of careful investigation. Documents that proved Colonel Sullivan had known the true effects of Desert Fire. Witness testimonies from other soldiers who had been ordered to cover up the extent of civilian casualties. Financial records that showed the colonel had been paid bonuses for effective suppression of hostile populations. Ayanna listened with growing amazement, not just at the thoroughness of Marcus's evidence gathering, but at the personal cost of his quest for justice. He had risked court-martial imprisonment and death to collect proof of his father's war crimes. He had sacrificed his health, his military career, and any possibility of a normal life. "Where is this evidence now?" she asked when he finished. "Hidden in 3 different locations. Copies with Dr. Morrison, copies with a lawyer in Santa Fe, and originals in a safe deposit box in San Francisco." Marcus shifted on his blanket, and Ayanna noticed that some of the yellow tinge was already fading from his skin. "If anything happens to me, Dr. Morrison has instructions to deliver everything to the territorial governor. And if nothing happens to you," Marcus met her eyes, "then I deliver it myself along with my own testimony about what I witnessed." Ayanna felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of the tight knot of anger she had carried since her mother's death. This white soldier, this son of her enemy, had spent 3 years of his life building a case that could finally bring justice for Fort Apache and all the other murdered Apache families. "Your father will know the evidence came from you," she pointed out. "Yes. He'll try to have you killed." "Probably." Marcus's voice was calm, matter-of-fact. "But he'll have to do it publicly now. Too many people know about the evidence for my death to look like an accident." As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of approaching horses carried across the desert air. Ayanna tensed her hand, automatically going to her knife, but Dakota stood and walked calmly toward the sound. "We have visitors," her grandfather announced in Apache. "Many horses, armed men." Ayanna felt ice form in her stomach. She looked at Marcus, who was already struggling to sit up despite his weakened condition. "How many?" he asked Dakota in English. 10, maybe 12. They ride from the direction of Fort Huachuca." Marcus's face went pale, but not from illness this time. "He knows I'm here. My father knows I came looking for you." "How is that possible?" "Dr. Morrison." Marcus pushed himself to his feet, moving with more strength than he'd shown since arriving at the camp. The medicinal tea was already beginning its work. "If my father questioned her under military authority," he didn't need to finish the thought. "If Colonel Sullivan had discovered his son's destination, he would come with enough men to ensure there were no witnesses to whatever happened next." Ayanna stood as well, her mind racing through their options. They were 3 people, a dying soldier, an old man, and a medicine woman against a dozen armed cavalry. Fighting was impossible. Running would only delay the inevitable. But there was a third option. "Can you ride?" she asked Marcus urgently. "I can try." "Then we go to them. On our terms, not theirs." Marcus stared at her. "Ayanna, that's suicide." "No," she said, already moving toward her medicine bag and her grandfather's weapons. "That's justice." The plan that formed in Ayanna's mind was desperate and probably doomed, but it was better than waiting to be slaughtered in the camp. If Colonel Sullivan wanted to silence his son and the Apache woman who could heal him, he would have to do it in front of witnesses in broad daylight, where his actions couldn't be covered up as easily. "Grandfather," she called in Apache as she gathered supplies, "take the horses and ride toward the trading post at Willow Creek. Tell everyone you meet what's happening here. I will not leave you, granddaughter. You're not leaving me. You're making sure our story survives even if we don't." Dakota's weathered face showed his understanding. If word of this confrontation reached the territorial authorities, even Colonel Sullivan's influence couldn't completely suppress an investigation. Marcus was checking his pistol, his movements steady despite the poison still working in his system. "The evidence," he said suddenly. "If I die here, make sure Dr. Morrison knows to release everything to the authorities." "You're not going to die here," Ayanna said firmly, though she wasn't sure she believed it herself. She had saved 1 vial of her strongest medicine, a concentrated mixture that could temporarily boost a person's strength and clarity at the cost of severe exhaustion later. Under normal circumstances, she would never give it to someone as weakened as Marcus. But these weren't normal circumstances. "Drink this," she said, pressing the small bottle into his hands. "It will give you maybe 2 hours of enhanced ability. After that, you'll collapse completely." Marcus looked at the medicine, then at her. "And you," Ayanna pulled out a second vial, one she had prepared for herself. "The same." They drank the potent mixture together, feeling the immediate surge of energy and focus that came with temporarily overriding their body's natural limitations. Marcus straightened his gray eyes clear and alert for the first time since she'd met him. Ayanna felt her own senses sharpen to the point where she could hear individual hoofbeats in the approaching cavalry. "Ready?" Marcus asked, checking his weapons one final time. Ayanna touched the small pouch at her waist that contained her mother's medicine stones, drawing strength from the connection to generations of Apache women who had faced impossible odds with courage and wisdom. "Ready?" she said. They mounted their horses and rode out to meet Colonel Sullivan's forces, leaving behind the safety of the hidden camp for the dangerous ground of an open confrontation with the most powerful military officer in the territory. Behind them, Dakota rode in the opposite direction, carrying the story of what was about to happen to anyone who would listen. Ahead of them lay either justice or death, and Ayanna White Dove was no longer sure there was any difference between the two. The confrontation took place in a natural amphitheater of red rock, where the desert floor opened into a wide, flat space surrounded by towering stone walls. Colonel Harrison Sullivan sat his horse in the center of 11 mounted soldiers, his bearing as rigid and commanding as if he were reviewing troops rather than facing his own son in what might be their final meeting. Ayanna's first sight of Marcus's father hit her like a physical blow. She had imagined him as some kind of monster, a man whose evil would be written clearly on his face. Instead, she saw a distinguished officer in his late 50s, gray-haired and dignified, exactly the sort of man white society would trust with authority over life and death. The banality of evil, she realized. The horror wasn't that Colonel Sullivan looked like a demon, it was that he looked like anyone's father or grandfather. Marcus rode slightly ahead of Ayanna, his posture military straight, despite the poison still working in his system. When they were close enough for conversation, he stopped his horse and faced his father across 20 yards of desert sand. "Hello, Father." "Marcus," Colonel Sullivan's voice was calm, controlled, showing no emotion at finding his son in the company of an Apache woman. "Dr. Morrison was very helpful once we explained the military importance of locating you. I hope you didn't hurt her." "That depends entirely on what happens here." The colonel's cold blue eyes shifted to Ayanna, studying her with the same detached interest he might show toward an unusual geological formation. "Miss White Dove, I presume. I've heard interesting things about your abilities." Ayanna said nothing, but she felt Marcus tense beside her at his father's notice. "What do you want?" Marcus asked. "I want my son to come home and resume his medical duties with the Army. I want him to stop this foolish quest for so-called justice over events that happened 7 years ago. And I want him to forget about the Indian woman and the fantasies she's filled his head with. And if I refuse," Colonel Sullivan's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes, a coldness that reminded Ayanna of winter wind off the high mountains. "Then I'll be forced to conclude that you've been corrupted by prolonged contact with hostile elements," the colonel said calmly. "I'll have to report that my son has turned traitor, providing aid and comfort to enemies of the United States. The penalty for treason is death, Marcus, even for family." The threat hung in the desert air between them, as clear and lethal as the rifles carried by the colonel's men. Ayanna felt the enhanced awareness from her medicine, showing her every detail of their situation, the positions of the soldiers, the nervous movements of their horses, the way Marcus's hand rested near his weapon. "And Miss White Dove," Marcus asked quietly, "will be taken to Fort Huachuca for questioning about her involvement with Army deserters and medical thieves. I'm afraid Apache women don't survive military interrogation very well." It was said with the same casual tone he might use to comment on the weather, and Ayanna understood with crystal clarity that Colonel Harrison Sullivan felt no more emotion about ordering her torture and death than he would about swatting a fly. This was the man who had killed her mother. Not in the heat of battle or the confusion of war, but with the cold calculation of someone who saw Apache people as obstacles to be removed rather than human beings with the right to exist. "You have 1 minute to decide, Marcus," Colonel Sullivan continued. "Ride home with me now and resume your proper place, or be arrested for treason and hanged along with your Apache whore." The words hit Marcus like physical blows, and Ayanna saw fury flash across his face. But when he spoke, his voice remained level. "I have a counter-proposal, Father." "Oh," Marcus reached slowly into his jacket, his movements deliberate and invisible to avoid giving the soldiers an excuse to shoot. What he withdrew was a thick envelope sealed with red wax. "This contains copies of military reports, witness statements, and financial records, documenting war crimes committed under your command between 1870 and 1873. Marcus said clearly, his voice carrying across the amphitheater. Specifically, the deliberate use of chemical weapons against non-combatant Apache civilians, the falsification of casualty reports, and the acceptance of monetary bonuses for ethnic extermination. Colonel Sullivan's face remained impassive, but Ayanna saw his horse shift nervously beneath him. Even if such documents existed, the colonel said carefully, they would constitute classified military information. Possessing them would itself be a treasonous act. True, Marcus agreed, but I'm not possessing them alone. Copies of everything in this envelope are already in the hands of Territorial Governor Anson Safford, Federal District Judge Edmund Wells, and Colonel James Morrison of the Inspector General's office. For the first time, Colonel Sullivan's composure cracked slightly. You're lying. Are you willing to bet your career and your freedom on that assumption? Ayanna watched the older man's face as he processed his son's words. She could see the calculating mind behind those cold blue eyes, weighing options, assessing risks, looking for advantages. Even if such evidence existed, Colonel Sullivan said slowly, it would be your word against mine. The testimony of a mentally unstable deserter and his Apache accomplice against a decorated career officer. Not just my word, Marcus replied. The word of every soldier who served under you and lived to regret it. The word of Dr. Morrison, who has documented the medical evidence of chemical weapon exposure. The word of territorial officials who are tired of explaining away massacres to Washington. And the word of Apache survivors, Ayanna added quietly, speaking for the first time since the confrontation began. Both men looked at her, and she felt the weight of their attention like a physical presence. But the medicine flowing through her system gave her strength to meet their gazes without flinching. My mother died at Fort Apache, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the desert space. But I lived, and I remember everything. I remember the smell of the chemicals your soldiers used. I remember the color of the smoke that rose from our lodges. I remember the sound my mother made when she died. Colonel Sullivan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The testimony of a savage would be inadmissible in any civilized court. Maybe, Ayanna agreed, but it would be very admissible in the newspapers, especially the newspapers back east where people are getting tired of reading about army massacres of innocent families. It was a shot in the dark based on nothing more than her understanding of white politics gleaned from conversations with Dr. Morrison. But Ayanna could see from Colonel Sullivan's expression that her words had found their target. You're bluffing, he said, but there was less certainty in his voice now. Marcus smiled grimly. There's one way to find out. Arrest us, Father. Take us back to Fort Huachuca for interrogation. Let's see how well you can explain to the territorial governor why you're holding an army medic and an Apache medicine woman on charges of treason. The standoff stretched across several heartbeats, tension crackling in the dry desert air, like electricity before a thunderstorm. Ayanna could feel the enhanced awareness from her medicine beginning to fade, but she forced herself to remain alert, watching for any sign that the colonel was about to order his men to attack. Sir, one of the soldiers asked quietly, what are your orders? Colonel Harrison Sullivan looked at his son, then at Ayanna, then at the envelope in Marcus's hands that contained the evidence of his war crimes. When he spoke, his voice carried the bitter recognition of a man who had just lost a game he had expected to win. We return to base, he said curtly. Immediately. But sir, I said immediately, Sergeant. The soldiers began turning their horses, but Colonel Sullivan remained motionless for a moment longer, his cold gaze fixed on Marcus. This isn't finished, son. Yes, it is, Marcus replied quietly. It finished the day you ordered me to murder Apache families. Everything since then has just been aftermath. Colonel Sullivan spurred his horse and rode away without another word, his men falling into formation behind him. Within minutes, the amphitheater was empty, except for Ayanna, Marcus, and the echoing sound of hoofbeats fading into the distance. Marcus swayed in his saddle as the effects of Ayanna's medicine finally wore off the temporary strength, leaving his system all at once. Ayanna caught his arm to steady him, feeling her own exhaustion beginning to claim her. Is it over? She asked. Marcus looked in the direction his father had taken, his gray eyes thoughtful. The immediate threat is over, but he'll try something else. Men like my father don't give up power easily. Then we'd better make sure the evidence reaches the right people before he can stop us. Marcus nodded, then looked at her with an expression of wonder that reminded Ayana of the way he had looked at her grandfather's simple food on their first night in camp. "You were magnificent," he said quietly. "The way you stood up to him, the way you spoke about your mother. I've never seen anyone face down Harrison Sullivan like that." Ayana felt heat rise in her cheeks at the admiration in his voice. "I was terrified the entire time." "That makes it even more impressive." They rode back toward camp in comfortable silence, the desert around them peaceful in the afternoon sun. Ayana found herself thinking about choices again. The choice she had made to heal Marcus, the choice he had made to gather evidence against his father, the choice they had both made to confront evil rather than hide from it. Marcus, yes. When this is all over, when your father has been brought to justice and my mother's death has been answered for, what will you do then? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice held a note of uncertainty she hadn't heard before. "I hadn't thought that far ahead," he admitted. "For 3 years, bringing my father to justice has been the only thing keeping me alive. I'm not sure what comes after that." Ayana felt something shift in her chest, a flutter of possibility she wasn't ready to name. "You could stay here, in Apache country. There's always need for someone with medical knowledge. Would I be welcome?" The question was simple, but Ayana heard layers of meaning beneath it. Would a white man be welcome among Apache people? Would a former soldier be trusted? Would she personally want him to stay? "That would depend," she said carefully, "on whether you could learn to see this land the way Apache people see it. Not as empty space to be conquered, but as a living thing that deserves respect." Marcus looked around at the red rocks and sparse vegetation, at the vast sky overhead and the distant mountains on the horizon. When he spoke, his voice held a note of reverence she had only heard before when he talked about medicine. "I'm willing to learn," he said simply. Ayana smiled, feeling the tight knot of anger in her chest finally begin to truly loosen. For the first time since her mother's death, she could imagine a future that held something other than grief and the pursuit of justice. "Then yes," she said, "you would be welcome." As they reached the hidden camp where Dakota waited with worried eyes and ready food, Ayana White Dove realized that healing, true healing, had nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with the choice to build something new from the ashes of old pain. Behind them, the sun was beginning to set over the desert, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded her of her mother's favorite time of day. But for the first time in 7 years, the memory brought comfort rather than sorrow. Some things she thought were worth the risk of hope. Epilogue: 6 months later, Territorial Governor Anson Safford signed the arrest warrant for Colonel Harrison Sullivan on charges of war crimes, dereliction of duty, and murder. The trial that followed made national headlines largely due to the compelling testimony of an Apache medicine woman who spoke with quiet dignity about the day her mother died. Marcus Sullivan's evidence proved overwhelming and irrefutable. His father was stripped of his rank, dismissed from service, and sentenced to life imprisonment at hard labor. He died in federal prison 3 years later, a broken man whose name became synonymous with military corruption. Darcera Morrison was honored by the territorial government for her humanitarian work and given official authority to establish medical clinics serving Apache communities throughout the Southwest. Marcus Sullivan never fully recovered from the chemical poisoning, but under Ayana's continued care, he lived far longer than any doctor had predicted. He spent his remaining years, nearly 20 of them, providing medical care to Apache people and documenting traditional healing practices for future generations. He and Ayana White Dove were married in a ceremony that honored both Apache traditions and territorial law, becoming one of the first legally recognized unions between an Apache woman and a white man in Arizona Territory. Dakota White Bear lived to see the birth of 3 great-grandchildren, all of whom learned to speak both English and Apache, to honor both the wisdom of traditional healing and the precision of modern medicine. Ayana continued her work as a medicine woman, but she also became something new, a bridge between two worlds, helping Apache people navigate the challenges of a changing landscape while preserving the knowledge and traditions that would ensure their survival. On quiet evenings when the desert wind carried the scent of sage and growing things, she would tell her children and grandchildren the story of how healing was always possible, even between people whose histories were written in each other's blood. Some wounds, she would say, could only be healed by choosing love over legacy hatred. It was a choice that had to be made new every day, but it was always worth making. Always.